This is Special Session. I'm your host, Brian Schott. It's been a particularly bad couple of weeks for the Utah Legislature. The referendum to overturn Utah's anti-union bill blew past the signature goal to get on the ballot. A judge ruled the state's private school voucher program is unconstitutional, and legislative leaders couldn't muster the support to override any of Governor Cox's vetoes from this past session. Essentially, lawmakers have more L's than the planet Krypton. We're going to talk about all of that in this week's show. Stay tuned. Plus, I'll have a conversation with former New Jersey Governor Todd Whitman. She's the co-founder of the Forward Party. In Utah, the United Utah Party and the Forward Parties merged last weekend, and she was in town to speak at the new organization's convention. In that conversation, we talk about the structure of the new party. It's not like traditional political parties. It's not top-down. I'll explain what that means later in the show, and we'll talk about how that works. Plus, how can this new party get their message to break through to voters in a traditional two-party system with a media system, a media ecosystem that is designed to ignore third parties? That'll be part of our conversation as well. That's all coming up in a bit, but first, let's dig into the news from the past week. Earlier this week, the referendum that's seeking to overturn Utah's anti-union bill, HB 267, blew past the signature goal that it needed to get on the ballot. HB 267 is the bill that was rammed through by Republican lawmakers this session and signed into law by Governor Spencer Cox that takes away the collective bargaining rights of public employees in the state. After that happened, a coalition of union groups called Protect Utah Workers, they came together and organized a petition drive to try and put this on the ballot for a referendum. It's really tough to get a referendum on the ballot. You need to get signatures statewide that are equal to 8% of all the active voters in the state. That's right now about 140,000 signatures, a little bit more than that. But you also need to hit that 8% signature goal in 15 of the state's 29 Senate districts. Referendum organizers turned in more than 320,000 signatures before the deadline, which was an impressive amount that really got a lot of people's attention. So unless a ton of signatures got thrown out, they were probably going to meet those signature goals. But not only did they meet them, but they crushed them. As of Friday morning, they had hit the goal in 20 Senate districts, not the 15, but in 20 of them, and had over 220,000 signatures certified. And they did reach the signature goal in a couple of Senate districts that are kind of eyebrow-raising. They met the goal in the district of Senate President Stuart Adams. They met the goal in Senate District 19, which is the home to Senate Majority Leader Kurt Cullimore. He was the Senate sponsor of HB 267, so that's a symbolic victory. And on Friday, they also reached the signature goal in Senate District 22, which is represented by Senator Heidi Baldery. And the reason that's significant is Baldery was an employee of the Utah branch of Americans for Prosperity. And Americans for Prosperity was one of those groups that was really pushing for this bill, and they were trying to organize an effort to get people to remove their signatures from the petitions in order to keep it off the ballot. That's part of this whole process. Once you sign the petition, your name is posted online, and then you have 30 days from that point to remove your name from the petition. And there was going to be an effort to try to convince people to take their names off of the petitions in order to keep it off the ballot, but there were so many signatures submitted, and they've surpassed the goals in so many districts that effort isn't going to happen now. It just doesn't work, and it would cost way too much money, and it probably wouldn't be successful. Back in 2018, there was a ballot initiative, the Count My Vote ballot initiative, which would have gotten rid of Utah's caucus and convention system for nominating candidates and gone to a straight direct primary, they secured enough signatures to qualify for the ballot. But there was another group, Keep My Voice, which was named that way to confuse people. They tried to do a ballot initiative to do the opposite of what Count My Vote did, but they didn't even get in close to the number of signatures that they needed, so they abandoned that effort. And then they just decided they were going to try to convince people to take their names off of the Count My Vote petitions. And they were able to get about 100 people in 2 Senate districts to remove their signatures, and that was enough to keep that ballot initiative off of the ballot. And opponents thought that they might be able to do the same thing here, but there were just so many signatures submitted that that wasn't going to work. And in fact, as of Friday morning, they're within striking distance of a few more districts. I would expect them to finish with maybe enough signatures to meet that 8% goal in 21, 22, maybe 23 of the state's 29 districts. Make no mistake, this is a massive rebuke to Republicans in the legislature. They were hailed by conservative groups across the nation. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, they praised Representative Jordan Tusher, who was the main sponsor of the bill, and Senator Kirk Cullimore, who was the Senate sponsor. They praised them once the bill passed. And this is something that's sort of near and dear to the heart of Senate President Stuart Adams. A couple of years ago, he was named as part of a group called the Workers for Opportunity Advisory Board. That's part of the Mackinac Center out of Michigan. Now, the Mackinac Center, they're officially nonpartisan, but this is a think tank that advocates for school choice, lower taxes, right-to-work laws. So what does that sound to you? It's a conservative right-wing organization, and this is an issue that they would be on the side of limiting union rights in the state. So this is something that aligns with Senate President Stuart Adams' belief system. He's also on the board of ALEC. So when these unions were able to organize and get enough signatures to put this issue on the ballot as a referendum, put the law on hold, and put it up to the voters, that's a big pushback, a big rebuke to the Republicans in the legislature. Also, this bill was a huge priority for a couple of conservative and right-wing groups in the state. I already mentioned Americans for Prosperity. I'm told that they were going to pour a bunch of money into the state as part of the effort to get people to remove their signatures from the petitions. This is an issue that they supported, but it was also a massive priority of the right-wing Utah Parents United. I've reported on this multiple times, but they talked about this bill before the session started. They really wanted to punish the Utah Education Association for any number of things. They didn't like the fact that they pushed back against Amendment A. They didn't like the fact that they sued to block the vouchers program, and we'll get to that in a second. Utah Parents United really was pushing this piece of legislation to punish the UEA. Utah Parents United, they had an effort called Decline to Sign. They were trying to get people not to sign the petitions. Didn't work big time. So this really is a black eye for the Republicans in the legislature, Utah Parents United, and other conservative groups that would be pushing for this initiative. It's not official yet. Next week is the deadline for clerks to finish verifying signatures, and then the lieutenant governor has until June sometime to decide whether or not it was sufficient to make the ballot. It's going to make the ballot. So the law will go on hold, and then it'll be on hold until the 2026 election when voters have a chance to weigh in on it. Governor Spencer Cox could call a special election this November because he has to issue a proclamation saying that this is going to be on the ballot. He could call a special election this November, but that would require the legislature to pay for a statewide election because we only have municipal elections this year, not a statewide election. And I'm not sure if that's what he is going to do or not. But the law will go on hold until voters have a chance to weigh in on it, and then expect big money to pour into the state on both sides of the issue. I reported that unions, not only here in the state, but nationwide, spent money and resources, millions of dollars, in the signature effort to put this on the ballot. They're not going to abandon this once it goes on the ballot. They're going to pay for advertising. They're going to pay for electioneering. And you're going to see groups like Americans for Prosperity minority and any other group that pops up opposed to this, trying to convince people to vote the other way. So this is going to be a very hot issue, at least until this year and probably 2026 when it actually goes on the ballot. Now, the only reason that this is possible, and remember this, is because the legislature didn't get 2/3 in both houses. They didn't get a 2/3 vote. If they had gotten 2/3, if they had gotten 50 in the House and 20 people voting for it in the Senate, then a referendum would not have been possible. This is only possible because there were enough legislators who had some hesitations about the issue to vote against it that they weren't able to reach that critical 2/3 threshold. Unless you've been living under a rock, you know that a judge found the Utah Fits-All Scholarship, our private school vouchers program, unconstitutional. That program, Utah Fits-All, allowed parents to take money that was supposed to go to public education, up to $8,000 a year per child, and use it for private school tuition, homeschooling expenses, or other educational expenses as they seem fit. There was very little oversight from the state. A judge found that unconstitutional, and the amount of cope and rewriting history among legislative Republicans is something to watch right now. What the judge ruled is that the program, Utah Fits-All, which was passed by the legislature in 2023, violated Article 10 and Article 13 of the Utah Constitution. Article 10 says that the state shall provide a public education system that is free and open to every student and free from sectarian control, meaning that it's free from the control of a religious organization. Also, it says that the State Board of Education is responsible for overseeing education in the state. And the judge ruled that the vouchers program is funding an education system that is not open to everyone, it's not free, and it's also not free from sectarian control because of religious schools. This ruling, and if you have a chance to read it, you really should. But this ruling says that these private schools, they have an application process. They can reject anyone, so that's not open to everyone. There's no requirement that these private schools have to accept the entire $8,000 in this quote-unquote scholarship as full tuition payment. So that's not free. They might have to pay more for that. There's nothing stopping these private schools from raising tuitions in order to get that state money and then continue to charge money on top of that. So that, according to the judge, is certainly not free. The system is not overseen by the State Board of Education. It was administered by an independent entity with, as I said, very little oversight as to where that money is going. Now, during this trial, the legislature tried to get cute with their defense. They argue that this program, these vouchers, they're not part of the education system because it's not overseen by the Board of Education. So it's not in violation of Article 10. And the judge didn't buy that. The judge said, no, this is an education program, and the legislature cannot create an education program that is outside of the public education program. They don't have the authority to do that, and that's why it's unconstitutional. That's it in a nutshell. There was a lot more nuance to it. The second part of it, the judge not only ruled that it was a violation of Article 10 of the Constitution, but the judge also ruled that it was a violation of Article 13. And Article 13, we've talked about it a lot before on this podcast. What that says is that any income taxes collected by the state, corporate income taxes and individual income taxes, they can only be used to pay for specific things. And those are public education and higher education, which is colleges and universities. In 2020, voters passed what was called Amendment G, and that expanded this constitutional revenue earmark a little bit. It said that this income tax revenue could also be used, quote, to support children and to support individuals with a disability. And the judge says this violates that constitutional article. It violates Article 13 because they are taking money that's supposed to go to public education and they are giving it to private education, which you cannot do, or homeschooling, which you cannot do. The legislature, in their defense, they tried to split hairs with the language because they looked at Amendment G and they zeroed in on the words "to support children." They argued that this program, Utah Fits All, the vouchers program, it supports children. So we can spend this money to support children. We can spend this money on these vouchers because we are supporting children. The judge went back and looked at all of the debates surrounding Amendment G when lawmakers were putting it on the ballot during the 2020 session, because the legislature is the only entity that can propose an amendment to the Constitution. So they were responsible for putting this on the ballot. And she looked at all of the debate, listened to the debate, read the transcripts, and she said that when they passed this resolution to put Amendment G on the ballot, there was absolutely no discussion of anything about school choice or vouchers or education. The entire debate, the entire pitch from the sponsors, from everybody who was pushing for this, their entire justification was providing services to children who have disabilities. And so what the legislature was trying to do was trying to retcon this language to support children into their justification on saying that we can spend this money. Now, even though the judge ruled that this is unconstitutional, and you should really read that ruling if you have a chance, because it's pretty solid, her explanation and her reasoning. But even though the judge found the program unconstitutional, they had a meeting this week and they said that they were going to keep the program in place until the Utah Supreme Court has a chance to weigh in on it. And that actually makes some sense, because there are families who are using this money right now, and they didn't want to pull the rug out from underneath them. And the application process for next year is already underway. Families are making plans on what they're going to do, and so they didn't want to interrupt that process either. So this is going to remain in place until the Supreme Court has a chance to weigh in, and that could be a while. The Supreme Court in particular, but the justice system overall, is not the swiftest of processes. If you look at what happened with the gerrymandering case, that case was given to the Utah Supreme Court in late 2022. They finally held arguments in July of 2023. That was more than 6 months later. And then it took a full year for their ruling to come down last summer. So I would not expect a swift decision from the Utah Supreme Court. It actually hasn't even been appealed yet to the Utah Supreme Court as we record this. Now, as you might imagine, Republicans in the legislature did not take the news well. Right after the ruling came out, there were a number of lawmakers who claimed that the Utah Constitution said that it's parents who are primarily responsible for the education of their children. So how dare the courts take away the rights of parents to choose how to educate their children? The problem with that is that it does not say that anywhere in the Constitution. That phrase is in Utah code. It's also in the Republican Party platform, but it's not in the Constitution. So a lot of people, they had to get off that particular soapbox when some people said to them, hey, you know what? Maybe you should read the Constitution, especially if you're a sitting lawmaker. So now a lot of the criticism that's coming down is that this is judicial activism. This is a judge who's acting out of politics rather than out of a good legal decision. I want to play this clip from Senator Kirk Cullimore. He was the Senate sponsor of this program. He's been one of the big proponents of it. He was appearing on the House of Representatives official podcast with Representative Candace Perucci, who was the main sponsor of the vouchers program bill when it was first making its way through the process in 2023, and they've worked on this together in subsequent years. So this may not be the most objective source of information on this topic, but listen to this clip where Cullimore expresses his displeasure for the judge's ruling.
What the judge ruled is that the Utah Fits All program was unconstitutional. But let's be clear, this seems like judicial activism. This seems like she had the end in mind and found a way to get there. And And the reason being is she declared it unconstitutional, and then for her to make these decisions, and not deem them to be political decisions. We had 2/3 of the legislature that approved this program. Mm-hmm. We had the governor sign off on this program. This program has been law for almost 2 years now and implemented for more than a year, with 10,000 kids benefiting from it right now. For one judge to undo all of that is just judicial activism at its best, and it's just not right that she should be able to do that.
They go on to once again highlight the to support children argument that they made about Article 13, and they spend a bunch of time in the interview talking about that argument that Amendment G allows them to spend money to support children, just rehashing the arguments rejected by the judge and saying that they hope that the Supreme Court will see their way when the appeal makes it there. And then Perucci says something really interesting. Now, one of the things that happened when they first passed this bill is lawmakers added in a pay boost, a salary increase for teachers if this passed. Initially, when they brought this up, it was portrayed as, this great thing they were doing for teachers, plus we want to take millions of dollars that are supposed to go to public education and put it towards private education and homeschooling, but we're giving this money to the teachers. It was portrayed as a sweetener, as an incentive to get the teachers on board, but in reality, what it was a poison pill, because if the bill failed, then there would be no raises for the teachers. There would be no salary increase for the teachers. So it was all or nothing. And even in the original legislation, teachers would not have gotten the full amount of the raise, the full amount of the salary increase, unless this program was funded at the full amount they were requesting. If it was funded at a lower amount, then teachers would only get half of the salary increase. So this was a poison pill, but Perucci portrayed it a little differently.
I think one thing that we haven't talked about a lot as part of this amazing bill was it was a grand compromise, right? And it was us focusing on teachers and students, driving it right down to the core of education. And so part of this was we gave a $6,000 compensation increase to teachers across the state, one of the biggest pay raises in Utah's history. And the union lawsuit of this and this decision actually puts that in jeopardy because the two are interconnected. You have to have the program in effect for that compromise to stand, which means the union not only went after a program that benefits families and children, but also a teacher pay raise, which seems a little bit crazy to me.
It wasn't a grand compromise. It was a poison pill, a carrot and a stick. Vote for this or the teachers don't get a salary increase. The Utah Education Association opposed this measure when it first came up. They were saying, yeah, we'd love to see our teachers get a salary bump, but not at the expense of taking money out of public schools. Millions of dollars, at this point, hundreds of millions of dollars a year out of public education. And that's what this is doing. Lawmakers get really, really prickly when you talk about how underfunded Utah schools are. And if you look at how much the state spends per student, we are always at or near the bottom of all 50 states in Washington, D.C., we are always in the bottom 3, most years in the bottom. And they get really prickly when you talk about that because they like to show how committed they are to education and how much money they've put into education over the past few years. A lot of the money that they put into education is required by Utah law. Every year, the legislature is required, it's mandated that they increase funding to cover inflation and any increase in the school population. This year, that was $178 million. That was the biggest chunk of money they put towards public education, and it was what they had to do. They had no choice in how much that is, and that's going to go up next year because this inflation is calculated on a 5-year rolling basis, and as lawmakers have been unhesitant, I don't know if that's a word, but unhesitant to point out, there's been a lot of inflation over the past few years. So that inflation figure is going to go up, and there's going to be more money going into public schools. But they have to do that. So even before the legislature started, last year in December, they voted to increase the WPU by 4% or $178 million, which was mandatory. They'll have to do that again this December. But if you look at what they actually spent this year, a lot of the big money was for their pet projects. Speaker Mike Schultz had his career and technical education program. That's $65 million that they put in there. They spent another $40 million on vouchers. They gave teachers another $1,000 salary boost, and that cost $50 million. That's money that could have boosted the WPU, which is the amount they spend per student, by another 1% or so. And that would have been a discretionary increase. What they did this year was mostly mandatory. So when you hear them talk about their commitment to education, a lot of that is stuff that they have to do in the first place. Now, this vouchers issue is not over yet. Lawmakers they've said that they're exploring what they call a legislative fix, which they can do. The easiest thing that they could do is fund the program out of the general fund. It would probably still have to be overseen by the state school board, and that's one of the reasons why they changed the structure of the program this year. If you remember, they passed a bill that brought this program under the umbrella of the State Board of Education. It wasn't before. There was a private company that was administering these vouchers, and they're no longer in charge of it. They're now looking for another company or someone to manage this program under the umbrella of the State Board of Education. They're still extremely autonomous, but they're at least under that umbrella. And when you look at this ruling, you can see that lawmakers are trying to fix something that they realized was a problem. They realized it was a problem because the Constitution says this public education system has to be overseen by the State Board of Education. So by bringing this program in under the umbrella of the State Board of Education, they're trying to fix that problem, or at least fix part of the problem. I don't know how they get around the free and open to everyone, because this is an educational program, but at least, the easiest thing that they could do, as I said, is fund it out of the general fund, not the income tax fund, which used to be called the education fund, but not fund it out of the general fund to at least get around that constitutional issue. No veto override session this year. Governor Spencer Cox vetoed 6 bills from the 2025 session, and this week legislattive leaders announced that they were not going to be calling for a veto override session. Even though there were 6 vetoes, there were really only 3 that were being seriously discussed for a veto override. There was HB 306 that would allow the state to pay vendors in gold rather than in cash if they wanted. That bill passed with both houses with enough votes to override a veto. And when they polled their members, I'm told that the House had enough support for a veto override, but the Senate was trying to get the House to add 2 other bills, get enough support to override the veto on 2 Senate bills that they wanted added to that agenda. That would be SB 37. That was the one that would divert property tax money collected by local school districts and take that money, instead of going directly to the local school districts, they would have to send it to the state, where it would go into the general fund, and then the state would send that same amount of money back to the schools from the income tax fund. So essentially it was money laundering. That's what critics said it was. And it was. They were taking money that was supposed to go to schools and putting it in the general fund. And then they were paying out of the income tax fund. And this would have boosted the amount of money available in the general fund, which funds everything else in the budget. And Governor Cox vetoed it because he said that it set a bad precedent and also called into question the commitment to funding education. Now, this bill did pass the Senate. It had the 2/3 support in the Senate, but they were 9 short in the House, and they weren't able to get 9 people to flip their votes, and that's why it didn't get added. Senate Bill 296, that bill changed the way that the Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court is selected. Currently, the 5 justices on the court, they vote among themselves and pick one of them to be the Chief Justice. And what this would have done has made it so that the governor would nominate the Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court, and then it would be that person would be confirmed by the Utah Senate. Governor Cox vetoed the bill. He said it caused politics to intrude into judicial matters, and there wasn't enough support really in either house to get this. 3 senators would have had to change their votes, and if they were trying to get the House to add this on, they probably would have gotten there, but there were 10 representatives who would have had to change their votes in order to get this added to the call. So that didn't happen, so they couldn't come to an agreement. That's what I'm told from legislative sources. Those negotiations were unable to reach a conclusion. They couldn't come to an agreement, so there will be no veto override session. Now, back to HB 306 for a second. This was sponsored by Representative Ken Ivory, and this bill, it had a lot of problems with it, and it shows how these ideas, and this was a very fringy idea when you dig into it, it shows how some of these fringe ideas can slip through the cracks because everyone up at the legislature is so busy. It's a 45-day session. There's just an onslaught of issues and legislation coming their way, and they don't have time to dig into these issues. But I did. And the genesis of this bill and the people pushing for it, it raises a lot of questions, really eyebrow-raising. So, the bill had a fiscal note. It would cost about $177,000. And that's because the state would have to hire a vendor to create a system to allow the state to pay vendors in gold, because they don't have that right now, and would have to integrate with the rest of the state's payment system. So legislative leaders were not going to fund that in the final budget. They weren't going to pay for it. And that's when a private person, a private entity, Kevin Freeman, he's a YouTube host, I guess, and an author, he offered to put the money up. Kevin Freeman wrote a book called Pirate Money, and I read it, and whoo boy, wow. This book argues that governments should change to precious metals as a payment system, as a currency system, instead of the currency system we have now. Basically, it's an offshoot of the going back to the gold standard theory. But the reason why is something else. The book centers around this thing called the Great Reset. And if you don't know what the Great Reset is, it is a conspiracy theory that a shadowy cabal of global elites are going to manufacture crisis, an economic crisis, crash the global economy in order to establish a totalitarian government. This started during the COVID pandemic, when the world's economy, because of the economic troubles, the economic difficulties because of the COVID pandemic. The World Economic Forum had a program called the Great Reset. And what they were doing is they were trying to figure out ways to help the global economy recover from the pandemic. But conspiracy theorists grabbed onto that and saw it as an insidious plot to enslave humanity, get rid of personal possessions and home ownership and cars and force vaccine, whatever you want. They could map whatever conspiracy theory they wanted onto this in service of this totalitarian government. And Freeman, in his book, argues that that's the reason why we need to start paying for things in precious metals, gold and silver, because these global elites led by Klaus Schwab, who's the head of the World Economic Forum, they're planning to enslave humanity. He talks about this specifically in the book. I read the book. I don't think many lawmakers read the book outside of Ken Ivory and whoever else. That's problem number 1 with this bill. Problem number 2 with this bill is that the state would have to establish a payment program that Freeman was going to fund, a payment program so the state could pay with precious metals. In his book, he mentions a payment app, a payment processing platform called Glint Pay. Gold, Glint Pay. He uses it. He mentions it at least 15 times in his book. Glint Pay was one of two companies that pitched their precious metal currency platform to Utah's precious metals work group last year. Freeman was a member of that work group, and he helped them write their final report that said the state should adopt a gold payment platform. So it kind of presents a little bit of a conflict of interest when the person who's offering to fund this thing for the state has already endorsed one of the companies that would probably be bidding to get the contract for this platform. Now, Representative Ivory, he said, well, he's just doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing this because he wants to see it done. He doesn't have a conflict of interest. He doesn't own a payment platform. We don't know that. We don't know what his connections are to Glint. He uses it. He endorses it. He advocates for it in this book. So that just seems like a little bit of a conflict of interest. But I know this stuff because I read the book. I read Freeman's book. I've dug into it. I took some time, and it wasn't an insignificant amount of time. I know for a fact that a lot of lawmakers they don't know these connections. They didn't read the book. They didn't look into it. They don't dig into these issues like this, and they are trusting their fellow lawmakers or lobbyists or whoever to be honest with them and explain the need for this sort of thing. If you ask Representative Ivory, he's not going to say, oh yeah, it's this conspiracy. He's not going to call it a conspiracy theory. But that's what it is. It is a conspiracy theory that we need to get rid of cash because the economy is going to collapse because we're going to all be enslaved. This bill did pass the House of Representatives the first time it went through unanimously. A bunch of Democrats even voted for it. It only got 58 votes when it came back after the Senate made some changes to it. I've talked to people who said it's likely that lawmakers really didn't understand what they were voting for the first time around. They spend precious little time even talking about these bills on the floor, and unless you're in the committee that digs into this, then you're really not going to be up on what the issues are, and even then, committee time can be extremely limited. So this bill is a perfect example of how these fringe ideas get adopted by governments because frankly, people aren't paying attention. Freeman has pushed for this in other states, and one state, I believe it was Louisiana, voted against adopting a gold payment system because they didn't know enough about it. And the lawmakers there who were pushing for it said they read his book. Unless you're going to have every lawmaker sit down and read his book as background information on this bill, they're not going to know what's going on. So this is just a perfect example of how this kind of idea can slip through the cracks and get adopted by a state if people really aren't paying attention to what's going on, or if people really don't understand the backstory. A couple of congressional stories that are worthy of your attention this week. On Wednesday, Utah Senators Mike Lee and John Curtis joined most of the rest of the Republicans in the Senate, and they voted against a bipartisan proposal that would have reversed the tariffs that President Donald Trump has imposed on nearly every country. The measure did end in a 49-49 tie, which meant that it failed. There were 3 Republicans who voted in favor of the measure: Rand Paul, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski. And that's interesting because Mike Lee and Rand Paul used to be aligned on almost every issue. This is a rare break between the two of them. But those 3 crossed party lines to vote with Democrats. Later in the evening, both Lee and Curtis voted to table a motion from the Democrats that would have allowed them to bring this issue back up for another vote next week. And that caused Vice President J.D. Vance to go to the Capitol and cast the tie-breaking vote to keep it from coming back up, because that also ended in a 49-49 tie. So Lee and Curtis, that kind of sounds like a steak sauce. Lee and Curtis, put it on your steak for bountiful flavor. Anyway, Lee and Curtis voted essentially to keep the tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed in place. Now, if this, even if this measure had passed the Senate and it only needed a simple majority, it probably would have gone nowhere in the House. But it was a symbolic measure or a symbolic effort to express some disapproval for President Donald Trump's tariffs, which are going to have a major impact on Utah's economy. A report from the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute last year said that in 2023, Utah imported $18.6 billion in goods from 151 countries. $10.9 billion of that, almost 60%, came from just 4 countries: the United Kingdom, Canada, Mexico, and China. And Utah exported $17.4 billion to countries around the globe, and $11.4 billion of that went to those same 4 trading partners: Canada, Mexico, United Kingdom, and China. So this is going to have a big impact on Utah's economy once these tariffs really kick in and get going. I reached out to the offices of Lee and Curtis, not the steak sauce, the senators, and they didn't respond. I didn't tell me why they voted in favor or voted against that measure to keep Trump's tariffs in place. So that's the first congressional story. The second story is in the House. All 4 of Utah Republicans in the House shot down a push by Democrats to investigate Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and his use of the Signal secure messaging app. The House Rules Committee earlier this week, they tucked a measure into a resolution that was targeting Biden-era environmental regulations. This little provision that they put into this bill paused what's called a resolution of inquiry. What a resolution of inquiry is a tactic typically used by the minority party to force a vote on launching an investigation. And what this provision did is it paused any resolution of inquiry until September 30th. As I said, this was part of a package of measures intended to roll back environmental regulations from the Biden administration. Blake Moore, Celeste Malloy, Burgess Owens, and Mike Kennedy, all 4 of those voted in favor of this measure, which passed on a straight party line vote. There was reporting that the reason why Republicans didn't want these resolutions of inquiry to come up is because the House is very narrowly divided. And if you get a few Republicans to join Democrats in voting to investigate Secretary Pete Hegseth's use of the Signal app, then it could pass, and they were very nervous about that. As has been widely reported, Secretary Hegseth allegedly shared details, attack details, classified information, sensitive information about military strikes in Yemen in one Signal group chat with White House officials that mistakenly included a journalist. It's a fantastic article in The Atlantic. You should go read it. And then there's been subsequent reporting that there was another Signal group chat that he shared many of these same details that included his wife and his brother and his personal lawyer. You would think that that's the kind of thing you would want to investigate, but Republicans in the House don't want to take the chance that they could launch an investigation into it, so they just removed the mechanism that would have allowed Democrats to push for that, and the 4 Republicans from Utah in the House voted in favor of that. Again, they did not respond when I reached out to them and asked them for a statement or a comment on why they voted in favor of that measure. Last week, the Utah Department of Health and Human Services informed lawmakers that they intend to resurrect Medicaid work requirements that have been on hold since 2020. They're going to ask the Trump administration for a waiver to implement these work requirements. If approved, the Medicaid recipients in Utah would be required to complete an online job assessment and online job training, plus they would have to apply for 48 jobs within the first 3 months. There are some exemptions to the program. Some of them are Utahns over 60, pregnant women, if you're working 30 hours a week, a few other exemptions as well. Students would also be exempt from these requirements. If you don't meet the requirements in the 3 months, then you're suspended. And during that suspension, it's a 3-month suspension, you can take steps to come into compliance by, completing the training, applying for the jobs, or getting an exemption. And if you don't come into compliance in those 3 months, then you lose your Medicaid eligibility. Now, In the document that I saw from DHHS that was sent to Utah lawmakers, they say that these work requirements will encourage work and community participation, help Utahns build a healthy lifestyle. They'll boost employment numbers while allowing the state to take their limited Medicaid dollars and allow them to focus it on the most vulnerable recipients. It's important to understand the history of work requirements in the state. Let's go back to 2018. Utah voters approved Prop 3 on the ballot. And what that did was that fully expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. What it did was it fully expanded Medicaid to all Utahns earning up to 138% of the federal poverty level. But lawmakers didn't like that. They were worried that it was going to cost too much. And so what they did was they overrode that citizen-approved ballot initiative and they passed a much more limited program. What that did was it expanded Medicaid to about 100% of the federal poverty line, but also required them to apply for a waiver from the federal government to implement work requirements. That waiver was granted by the Trump administration in late 2019, like late December 2019, right before Christmas. So the Utah Work Requirement Program, it got approved and it kicked in on January 1st, 2020. But it was suspended by the state a few months later in April because of the COVID pandemic. And it never restarted. And then there was a change in administration. Joe Biden won the election. The Biden administration then yanked that waiver away from Utah and a couple of other states that had gotten it granted under the Trump administration. So this program, which was approved by the first Trump administration, was in effect for about 3 months, about 3 months, I would say, before it was suspended, a little over more than 3 months before it was suspended, and it never restarted. That's not the first time that lawmakers have tried this sort of thing. Back in 2014, Utah was trying to figure out a way to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, but they wanted to come up with their own Utah solution. And one of the things that they proposed was a work requirement. The federal government said no, that didn't work. And even back in 2010, the legislature floated a pilot program that would have required Medicaid recipients to do community service in order to get the benefits. That also didn't go anywhere. But we're back with the Trump administration back in the White House, so you can expect that this waiver is probably going to get approved. Last month, a couple of other states, Arizona and Arkansas, they submitted applications for these waivers, and those are probably going to get approved as well. There was a case that was going to the Supreme Court challenging these work requirements, but after the Biden administration suspended the work requirements, suspended the waivers, the Supreme Court decided the issue was moot and they decided not to rule on it. So they just kicked the suit to the side. Utah has about 351,000 people on Medicaid right now, according to the latest statistics from the state. Enrollment jumped, like it really jumped by about 200,000 people during the COVID pandemic. And that makes sense. You know, there was a health crisis. People were out of work. So it jumped by nearly 200,000 people, but it has since fallen back. It's almost back to pre-pandemic levels. Critics say that imposing these work requirements could really put a lot of people nationwide and also here in the state at risk of losing benefits. There was a study from the Nonpartisan Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, in fact, earlier this year, and they estimate that putting a work requirement in place would put about 38% of Utahns, or about 127,000 people, at risk of losing their benefits. We don't even know what this is going to look like because Congress is looking at big cuts to Medicaid in order to pay for their big tax cut package. So we don't even know how much money the state is going to have or whether they're going to have to cut back on benefits because of budget cuts at the federal level to Medicaid. Expect this request for a waiver to impose these work requirements, to reimpose these work requirements, to get approved fairly quickly. Utah already had it once, so I anticipate that they will probably get those work requirements approved again, and the program will be back in place at some point in the near future. Last weekend, members of the United Utah Party dissolved their organization. They've been around since 2017, and they voted to merge with the upstart Utah Forward Party. With about 2,400 members, the new organization becomes the sixth largest political party in Utah, just ahead of the Green Party. It's part of the National Forward Party, which was launched by former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang in 2022. It's believed to be the first time that two political parties have merged in Utah. I can't seem to find any other reports of this happening before, so it is historic in that sense, but you have to wonder just what kind of an impact they'll be able to make here in the state, or how much traction they'll be able to get. The most high-profile member of the new party is Senator Daniel Thatcher. You'll remember he resigned his position in the Republican Party on the final day of the 2025 legislature to join the Forward Party. During his speech at the convention, he had some pretty pointed criticisms of his former political home.
The absolute contempt coming from the legislature this year just completely blew my mind. I have for years been concerned about the direction, but I always believed that the GOP would come back to its founding principles. Amendment D completely made it clear that that is not going to happen. Since I left the GOP in March, I have had so many people say, why did you change your principles? And I feel like I have to keep repeating myself. I have never changed my principles. So because I believe that the GOP has ceased to uphold the rule of law, because they are no longer grounded to the Constitution, and because they're not even following their own platform, which was why I joined them in the first place, they are no longer entitled to my support. My commitment is not to a party or any individual, no cults of personality for me, thank you. My commitment is to principles. Should you leave a party that you belong to and join the Forward Party? I can't answer that question for you, but I can answer it for me. The Forward Party is different from anything I've ever seen before. It is why I feel so at home in this place that feels clean. I feel safe in this room. I feel respected in this room. I feel like I can disagree with someone and not have any name calling or tables flipping. I love that we are not locked into, you must believe this policy to belong. You must pass a litmus test, a purity test, or you can't be in our party. I love that we are committed to principle. I don't want to fight Republicans or Democrats. I want to fight ignorance and contempt.
The Forward Party is interesting. It operates differently than a traditional political party. Instead of a top-down approach, individual state and local parties decide which issues are the most important. Instead of a party platform, they have a list of priorities, and members vote on that list. Anybody can propose something to be added to the list, and then the members vote on it, and the top vote getters are what the party focuses on. On Saturday, the members of the merged party they cast ballots on what their first list of priorities would be as a newly merged organization, and the results were interesting. At the top of the list, election process reform, representative voting districts, voting methods, campaign finance reform, government transparency. They want to limit partisan influence. Those are things that got like 70% support when people voted on them. And you could vote for as many as you wanted to. Immigration, that was actually in the middle, about 60% support. And the very bottom, the last place issue was the right to bear arms, 29% support. anybody who is nominated or anybody who wants to run as a member of the Forward Party, they just have to sign a pledge that says, among other things, that they'll uphold the Constitution, they believe in the rule of law, pretty basic stuff. Now, the keynote speaker at Saturday's event was Forward Party co-founder Christine Todd Whitman. She's the former Republican governor of New Jersey. She also was the head of the Environmental Protection Agency under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2003. I sat down with Governor Whitman on Saturday for a brief conversation about the party. We talked about how a national party can function when you've got local entities deciding what's important to them rather than one grand unifying concept. And we also discussed how they can get their message to resonate in a media ecosphere that can be, at times, difficult to penetrate. Now, one note for you, in this interview, Governor Whitman says that they count Utah Senator John Curtis as one of their supporters. That struck me as odd, and you can hear it in the interview, so I reached out to Curtis's people. They said that they have spoken a few times with people involved in the Forward Party, but there's no official connection. It's not much more beyond just talking and some friendly exchanges. In fact, one person close to Curtis said that they actually had to ask the Forward Party to stop using his name in connection with their support. And they also found it a little curious that Whitman would bring him up. And so now, with that important context, here's my conversation with Governor Whitman. Governor Whitman, the Forward Party It's unlike anything I've heard of, where you're letting local parties, local candidates decide what's important to them, and it's not a top-down. Right. Talk about how you're going to make that work, because it feels like it might be herding cats. Or it feels like you have to. You obviously have to change your paradigm of how you view how politics are supposed to work.
People are used to, if you're Republican, you stand for X, Y, and Z, or Democrat, you do A, B, C. That's not what we are, because our country is so diverse and our communities are so diverse that the needs and the wants of people are very different. And we should have representatives, people in office who can represent their constituency, what matters to them, what's important to their state. I mean, border issues are big in Arizona, but they're not major issues in New Jersey. And so people, it makes no sense, if you think about it, to have national parties that have these hard and fast issues to which you've got to adhere. So what we're saying to people is, we're giving you the opportunity to vote for someone or to support a party that says, we have principles, and these are the principles that are going to guide us. And we're very clear that a candidate who wants the support of Forward or wants to be a Forward candidate where we are on the ballot signs a pledge that says they'll uphold the rule of law, respect the Constitution, work with anyone to solve problems, create a safe space to discuss controversial issues, and work constantly to ensure that people who are have a legal right to vote get to vote. And it's based on the principles of protecting our democracy, ensuring a diversity of opportunity for people, and dignity, by giving people the kinds of educational opportunities, job training, and things that they can earn their own living. And then beyond that, we have recommendations of how best to accomplish things, such as if you want to ensure that people have an opportunity to vote, well then, maybe ranked choice voting, open primaries, first across. There are a lot of different ways to do it. And we're saying you don't have to do it this one way, but here are ways that have worked, and see what will work in your community.
You bring up a very interesting point about how border issues are very important to people in Arizona, but not in New Jersey. But when you look at the Republican Party today, that is a core tenet of what the party is very worked up about right now, our border issues. And it's mainly because they have a media apparatus that pounds this message daily to a very small group of people, to a very small, devoted, and loud group of people. Right. How do you break through that to get how does a party break through that when there's this institutional structure that basically dictates what the followers of one party are going to be upset about or very passionate about on a given day?
Well, you said it. They're very loud. The minority is very loud, but that's the minority. It's not a majority in most of the parties. It's not a majority. And so we're talking to the people who are feeling, look, I care about this issue, but I'm not crazy, or I'm not, I think some people are going to the extreme. When you can get people, as we said in the meeting earlier, when you get people in a room and they agree that this is an issue, and they say, and you bring them from different sides of that issue and say, do you agree this is an issue? They say yes. Then you say, okay, let's solve it. Let's sit down and talk about it. And to your point, and it also is our point, twice now in recent years, well, I guess 2001 isn't that recent anymore, but in 2001 or the end of 2001, beginning of 2002, George Bush 43 sent an immigration bill to the Hill for the Hill to do what it normally does, which is to hold hearings on it. They never held a hearing because they didn't want to solve the issue. And then in this last presidential cycle, there was a bipartisan bill, had good bipartisan support, would have passed. But the president, now president, and then the presidential candidate, Donald Trump, said, don't do it, don't pass it, because I want the issue to use as something to excite my base. Well, a lot of people said, that's wrong. This is a major issue that could and should be solved. And they don't like that. And that's what we're saying. And you can get through to that. More and more people. That's why the fastest growing party and the largest party now in the country is the unaffiliateds, who are saying, pox on both your houses. I'm not seeing you solve problems. I'm not seeing you address the issues about which I care, or at least not doing it in a sensible way. And I want something different.
How do you break through the problem of negative partisanship? People don't vote for anything anymore. They vote against something.
I think they will vote for if they're given something to vote for and someone they vote for. And that's actually why, while we have congressional candidates. We have a U.S. Senator, thank you, Senator Curtis, who's affiliated with the Forward Party. We have Congress people who are affiliated with...
Senator Curtis is?
He's affiliated with the Forward Party. He's not he didn't run as a forwardist.
Okay.
But he is counted as one of ours because we did a lot of support for him and worked with him.
You're talking about John Curtis here in Utah? Or?
Here in Utah, yes.
Interesting, okay.
Yeah. And what we're saying, we're starting at the local level. And when somebody sees somebody running for school board or town council that they know and respect, and they hear this message of how they're going to run as a forwardist, that's where you start to build. And people will vote for that person. And then what history has shown us, when they come to the ballot box to vote for one, they'll stay on the ballot and look for similar candidates up and down. And that's why we're trying to run as many as we can. We're in districts where it makes sense, of people who are forwardists, who agree with our principles. And that's the kind of thing that will make the difference and start the wave. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. I mean, we're hoping by 2028 we are a nationally recognized party by the Federal Election Commission, but that's a ways off.
You have been in the political arena for a very long time.
A very long time.
And it used to be that you had the fringes on both sides, on the right and left. They were very loud, but they weren't able to really do anything. Right. And the middle is where the decisions were made. Right. It feels like that has been inverted, where you have these very loud fringes on both the right and left, and they're driving our policy right now.
No, you're right.
How do you flip that back to the way it was? Because there are people who are unaffiliated, not affiliated with either party, but by the time they get to the ballot box, a lot of elections for Congress are already decided.
Well, that's where we elect our people, and that's where you start making a difference. The beauty is, what you need to understand is you don't have to have 100%. You don't have to have all the legislators. You only need that fulcrum, that nucleus that can make a difference. I mean, if you think back at the past Congress, and you think of Joe Manchin, one single senator, who was pivotal on a whole major number of issues, and he was able to affect votes. That's one person in the Senate. So you don't have to have everybody. And what we're saying is we'll get enough in these state legislatures or town councils who start to make that difference and can start to break through. And then it's what people want. I mean, it's clearly what people want if you see the way that the party has grown to date.
Governor Whitman, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
That's all I got for this week. Thanks for listening. I'd like to remind you to subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. Also, leave us a rating and review anywhere you can. That helps new people find the show. It's the best way to build the audience for this program. Shameless plug here. Remember to sign up for my newsletter. It's at utahpoliticalwatch.news. You can sign up for free, but you can also become a supporter of my work as an independent journalist by becoming a paid subscriber. It's as little as $5 a month. What I do takes time and resources, and I'd love to be able to, but I can't do it for free. So I rely on subscribers to keep doing what I'm doing. This is my full-time job, and I intend to keep doing it as long as I can. But the only way that I can do that is if I get support from listeners. I don't have billionaires telling me what I can and cannot cover. You are my boss. The people who support my work, they are my boss, and I'm so thankful for all of them. And if you feel like you can swing it, go over to my website, utahpoliticalwatch.news, and become a subscriber. If you are a business and you'd like to support and sponsor this podcast, let's talk. My email is linked in the show notes, and I'd love to hear from you. Drop me a line. You can also email me if you have feedback on the show, questions, complaints, hate mail, if there's a guest you'd like to hear from, if there's a topic you'd like me to cover. Also, hit me up on email. Plus, I can be found on almost every social platform except for, you know the one. I'm not over there anymore. My thanks again to Governor Christine Todd Whitman, and thank you for listening. We'll be back with another episode next week.